Kalispera. Good evening, everybody. I must say I'm personally really overwhelmed by this opportunity for me to speak and for you, such a wonderful audience. I allow myself to say, looking at you, not all of you, that I think I'm an older Cypriot than you are. Because I am a Cypriot for 65 years now, you see. And I want to make it very clear, I have no reason for saying so. It's not that I was then here in Cyprus, and now I'm here. I've been in Cyprus since then. This is now the 7th time. And we and my family and my wife, I'll speak about them, we are always in love with Cyprus, and we love the Cypriot people, and in particular in love with Papa Vasilios, who was the best of our friends from the time of the camps. And I'll try to say as much as I can personal things, but without some general sort of things I think I cannot do. You already mentioned that there were something like 52,000 altogether people who went through the camps. True. A few less, as we heard, because some of us were getting out not in the regular way. But I think I should like to add that in the 30 months, the 2.5 years, from August 1946 to April 1949, 2.5 years, there were 2,200 children born in the camps or by the camps, which means, just to think of it, almost 2.5 per day. 2.5 Jewish kids being born. And I won't go into the details of it. Most of these kids were not physically born here in the camps, but they were born in the British military hospital in Nicosia, Lefkosia as we call it now, in Nicosia then. But they were there with their mothers just a day or two, and then they were returned to the camps. I don't have to go into the details of the life of the camp. Of course, this is very important, but I don't think we have enough time for it now. I think it's important to try to give an impression, as much as we can, of the camps as they were at the time. We all know there were two groups of camps, the winter camp and the summer camp, or rather the summer camp and the winter camp, the summer camp coming first. In Karaulos, that is to the north of Famagusta, mostly camps, almost completely camps organized by tents, that is to say very rough places to live, and the Kelia or Xilotimbo or the area between them, we call them both. We call them winter camp, which are usually Nissen huts. Nissen huts with something like over 15 inhabitants. For some of us, like me, who came to the Cyprus camps legally with a passport, and could come in and get out anytime. We lived in camps as not at that time Israelis, at that time we were Palestinians, Palestinian Jews. But we came and we worked in the camps as such, and I will say a few words about all of this. And what were really, I think, the important aspect of the camp life were three things. For one, life in the camps, believe me, I lived there for almost a year and a half in a winter camp, in Camp 65. Life was miserable. And I repeat it, because with all the good intentions, and there were very good intentions, the life was miserable. And the life was miserable for a number of reasons, which I'd like to mention. First of all was obvious, everybody understands this, because this was a life in prison. Never mind that it was different from some other prisons around the world. It was incarceration. People could not get out. There were some exceptions. I'll tell you a few about a few exceptions in a moment. Secondly, most of the inhabitants at that time in the camps, most of them, the great majority of them, were rather young people. That's to say, up to the age of 40. Very few over the age of 40. People, young people, who had passed the Holocaust in Europe, in different European countries, many too young to pass the Holocaust. This is just the babies of the time. Most of them, please remember this, who were of school age and beyond, did never have any education or never had any formal kind of education for more than a year here and a year there. There were a few who had a regular education, particularly in Romania, from Romania. In other words, these people knew they were coming to Palestine at the end of the day. But they knew they did not have the minimal education everybody has. And on top of it, they had nothing what to do in the camps. Boring. And that's good. And what do you do? And what do you do if it's boring? You might think that while you're living in such a situation, you'll be nasty. Well, at least you don't have anything on you other than a piece of cloth and a pair of rotten shoes, and nothing else, So there's nothing what to steal one from another, for instance. And there was nothing to steal, but I want to make a point. In a situation like this, where everybody could be just on his own, to much as possible, there was no to speak of. There was no violence, and there was no misuse of personal power, and some of them had power and others and so on. And the regular and the civilized living under these conditions, which is a problem in many societies around the world, And you would have thought this is a special problem here, but in spite of the fact that everybody's coming here from a civilized place, this was kept to an unbelievable extent, which still have known these people and having lived with these people, I find it difficult to really quite understand how well organized and how humane our conduct of things was. But in this connection, I'd like to say a word or two about the way life in the camps was organized. It's a generalization I'm making because there's always differences and there are always exceptions. But by and large, I think it might be of interest. Basically, one of the positive aspects, if you can talk about positive things in this connection, one of the positive aspects of the life in the camps, both in the winter camp and in the summer camp, there was no difference, basic difference between the two, and from this point of view, was the fact that the British, after all, this was a British colony, and they were caught, these people were caught in the sea, usually not far from here, on the way, on the seaway to Haifa, to the Palestinian coast. These people were the kind of people I just mentioned, and I tried to describe in a sentence or two. But it was agreed between the British and these Jews that the British will rule the situation outside the camps. And inside the camps, the British will not rule. Inside the camps, the rule and the organization will be by these people themselves. And of course, it wasn't quite as clear-cut as I was just mentioning it now. Because, for instance, just to give one prime example, what do people eat inside the camps? They can't produce it themselves. They can't buy it for themselves. Of course, the British have to support it. It's a prison, and like in a prison, the prison inhabitants get the food from the rulers of the prison. So, for food, the camp inmates were dependent on the British government, or more specifically on the British Army in charge of the camps. All right. And you do. And you give these people inside the camp the amount of money you give to British soldiers. But believe me, it wasn't enough for the British soldiers, and it wasn't enough for the Jewish inhabitants of the camps. And people were hungry most of the time. Just to talk about the food. But here is this fence, 3 meters high. And these are people inside and the others are the outside. How do you bring in the food from the outside into the inside? Well, of course, you have to carry the inside somehow by way of the gate. There were gates, big gates in old camps. Well, and who does this job? Well, there are the British soldiers who could do it. And there are some Jewish inmates who you rely and you let them out a little bit out of the gate and take up some of the stuff and bring it into the camps and distribute it, and I'll say a word about it if I've got time for it. And there are some local people in this country, some Greek people, Cypriots, living there, who are trusted by the British and by the Jewish inmates. And they are people who bring stuff in. And since I haven't got that much time, I'll say it right now. If you really trust them, and you really, as a Jewish inmate, or as a chief organizer of the Jewish inmates inside the camps, and you believe them, you can, after a while, have confidence in them. They bring in not only the food from the British Army, but they smuggle in some things which we inside the camps ask them to bring in. Maybe not big cannons or machine guns, but maybe small kinds of weapons, or things which are looking like weapons and can be used as such, or all kinds of other things which we inside want to make use of, but the British wouldn't give it to us and wouldn't allow it to us. But these men, if I believe in them, and I do believe in them, or they get the word from some person higher up in the Greek community, who tell him, be nice to the Jews, be nice to them, let them come bring in some certain things. So there becomes the two-partite division. Jews and British becomes a tripartite situation. British, Jews, and Greeks, local people. And if I would have time, I would have been spoken now just about the Greek inhabitants. But I would like to say before a few words about the organization of the Jewish, let me call it, community in the camps in those days, in the 2.5 years, 46 to 48, for the beginning of 49. I make it as brief, and for this reason, exaggerate it a little bit, as I possibly can. Basically, from the point of view of the population inside the camps, I would say, this is my way of looking at things, there were two major seasons. There was the season until the beginning of 1948. And then from that time until the end of the camps, another year basically, until February 49. Why I make this distinction? I'll tell you. Around between Christmas and New Year, 47, 48, came the two big Pan-York and Pan-Crescent ships into Cyprus. Altogether, the two boats, over 15,000 people on two boats. Never have there been anything like this. They were all people from Romania. The boats themselves started in Bulgaria, but the people on the boat were Romanian. Until that time, until the coming of the two pans, I think it's fair to say, by and large, the total organization of the departure of these people out of Europe, from European countries or harbors to Palestine and then to Cyprus, were all organized. Am I doing it?
Sorry. Thank you.
Were all organized by Zionist political parties. I can't say dozens of them, but at least a dozen of them, who were all existing in Palestine among the Jews, but as well in the diaspora in Europe all over. And including, incidentally, also North Africa, because 2 boats out of the 39 boats who came to Cyprus, 2 boats of them were coming actually from North Africa and brought people from the North African Jewish diaspora. Everything was organized by the political parties. To get on a boat, to get permission, so to speak, to get on the boat, is by way of a membership in a party, or at least by the word of a party. Driving in the boats, of course, were organized by the party. And living in the camps in Cyprus was always in groups of the people of the same party. There were always exceptions, there always are exceptions, but by and large, this was the situation. Parties did everything. After the coming of the parents from the Romanian Jews, where the political parties were also active, they were active, I must say, but much less so well organized, the power of the political parties, for instance, in putting people on the boat, even then, on the 2 bands, the power of the political parties was much less strong than from what I described just for the time before. Every camp and every group of camps had a committee, which really was some sort of domestic government, if you want to call it. Of course, this was organized by parties. If there were lots of people of the same party, they had many members on the committee. If you were a small group, then you had a very small membership in the committee. If you didn't have, or very few, didn't have any member on the committee. And this was the ruling, domestic ruling in the camps. And it was very, very, very effective. They had, among other things, to show the argument, they had a domestic, organized by themselves, inside the camps, had nothing to do with the British. They knew about it, but they had nothing to do with them. A police force. And they had a court. If somebody did something which people didn't like or was looked upon as there was no law book to go by. But misbehavior, or looked upon as misbehavior, there was a court. And the court had the power, the courts had the power to handle out punishments. Well, nothing like it. No one had money, so you couldn't really put monetary punishments, or hardly ever. There were a few cases like that too. And you wouldn't hit people as punishment. But there were cases here and there, both in the summer camp and in the winter camps, that people who did something very serious were put, believe it or not, people who were living in a prison put these people in a prison of themselves. Says, you have to stay now in this tent or in this wherever, and you are not allowed to go out for a month. That's a prison. Happened. And so on and so forth. I can't go into it. There was self-government, to the best of my knowledge. Finally, כמה זמן יש לי עוד? I must also add, because I think it's important and I think for you to understand. There were other organizations, one of them they were mentioned before. There were, without going into details again, there were Jewish organizations in Palestine who tried to help the people in the camps. For money, for whatever it is. And there are lots of them. And they were very useful. Or there were kids, I mentioned them already, teenagers, let's say, who basically had no education before because of the war and the Holocaust and everything which goes with it. So a Jewish organization in Palestine brought over a number of teachers from, of learned person. They weren't really teachers, or most of them weren't teachers. Brought them over from then Palestine into the camps to teach these people. Because somebody asked me, that's what I did. I came there as a student at the Hebrew University. And after my army service. And I was here with colleagues of mine, and we were teaching daily teenagers. But the most important, by far the most important organization inside the camps and outside the camps was the Haganah, the Jewish Haganah, with all its subunits. And the Haganah was bringing people over from Palestine to teach them to give a military training of some sorts. Not very serious training, but there was. And at the beginning, the Jewish people who were running the boats, which came to the camps at the end, stayed in the camps as the people who knew best how to treat all these big number of people. Later on, of course, it was found that you have to find specific people for training in military or quasi-military kind of activities. And again, there's so much to be said. One of the things, which the Haganah and its branches took upon itself was, before that I should say, most of the people of the Haganah who came from Palestine did not came like most of the others came from Palestine, did not come legally. That is to say, they came illegally. That is to say, they had to be smuggled into the camps. And there are many ways, and I'm not going to teach you now all the ways how to smuggle people into camps. There are very many. Part of them, but since I mentioned it already, was by help of the Greek population, some of them. But another way of doing it is to buy underground tunnels. And underneath the fence, and these tunnels had a two-way purpose. The main purpose was, not what I just said, the main purpose was to smuggle people out of the camps. To smuggle people out of the camps. And we heard about over 1,000 people who are missing the count at the end of the day, at the end of the camps. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them were people who were smuggled out by way of the tunnels. And outside that there are some pictures. There's a picture of one of the tunnels being built. You can see how people were sort of crawling there. It wasn't pleasant. But this was getting people out. And if you really want to know all about it, because the chairman already said so many things about me, I was there as a teacher, and I was legally there, so I could get legally inside the camp and outside the camp. But I had a second job there. And my second job was to smuggle people out of the camps. And I didn't do very much. It's because I could go out and wait for people coming out of these holes, from underground holes, outside the camp, and pick them up there and take them wherever I had to take them to get, at the end, to get to a boat, which would carry them illegally, of course, to Palestine. But I was also caught by the British. Don't think the British didn't exist. And I was also in prison because the British caught me with a taxi. And here, let me say, who was the taxi? I didn't have a taxi. They didn't have a taxi. The taxi was driven by a local Greek man who was the driver of the car. And he was, of course, also caught by the British or taken into custody. And he also was sitting in prison for a while. So these tunnels, these underground tunnels, were mainly for taking people out of the camp, but they were also used, of course, for illegal people from the outside getting into the camp and to smuggle into the camps, again, illegal materials. Weapons or quasi-weapons or what were looked upon as weapons, they weren't very serious, but they were. And I think I have to come to an end. So you will allow me, I hope you will allow me, if I say a word about these Greek participants in our work. Most of them did it for political and ideological reasons. They wanted to help these Jews. You can understand, of course, that one of the political reasons for this was it was against the British. They were, most of them, against the British. And here we were doing things against the British. So there was a common ground of activity. And I think this did play. I heard this very often by people saying so. But I take the opportunity to add because I think I'm doing a service to history here. As you know, this was very much organized by Arkel. And I'm not going to say now about the politics of Arkel. I'm not going to want to go into that, of course. But let's say we all agree it was very left. And part of the political thought, not of the people who were doing these jobs, but the people who were giving them orders higher up in the hierarchy of these groups of people, were really expecting that the politics in this Jewish community, which by the end will come to be something a Jewish state, will be as leftist as they were leftist. And on this issue, as I guess some of you at least know, there came to split it at the end. And there were others. And let me just say, because he has been mentioned, he should be mentioned. Prof. Vasilio was one of these persons who did it not for those political reasons, but he did what I mentioned, the humanitarian reasons. And there were many of them. That it is inhuman, and the British can't do this 2 or 3 years after the end of the war, 2 or 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, with millions of Jews killed, and with the parents and the brothers and sisters of so many of those people who were here now in Cyprus, being killed. To do this sort of thing to them is absolutely inhuman, unbelievable, not to be accepted. So it was the political, and it was an ideological on the one hand, and what I would like to call the humanitarian aspect. Prof. Vasilio, he was a politician at the time, but not of the, and he was, but I want to say, and Christakis, I hope you don't mind if I say, he was one of the organizers on the outside, on the Greeks, and most of the drivers that I was talking about, there were many other groups of people, where people organized with, or at least somehow in connection with him. And this was an unbelievably important job from our point of view. But in 1940, what am I talking about now? In 1948, at the height of the population in the camps, Prof. Vasilio left the Arkel party. I never knew why he left exactly, he never would tell me. But I have the feeling that he had the feeling that Arkel was at that time, we're not talking about the 50s, and we're not talking about the 60s, we're talking about the 50s, the 40s. But that he had the feeling at that time, which was completely different than the 50s. It's important to remember that Arkel was going, not exactly where it is, but the worker union, which he was one of the founders and leaders, they were very much supporters of our thing. I just want to mention, if you will allow me, one more thing. There were many other services done, not only teaching, that I spoke about briefly, and not only the Haggalah, the military, so-called military services, but there's at least one which was a question of medicine and health. The British could not. They didn't have the power and didn't have the wish and the will to deal with all the medical problems of all these thousands of people, including this whole business of young people and children and babies These were doctors of officers, of military people. They were not doctors of children and so on. So they couldn't deal with this, even if they would have wished. So they had, this kind of group of people had to be brought into the camps. And they all came from Palestine, from Jewish Palestine. Doctors and nurses, and I will end with this. One of the nurses who was brought here and was made the chief nurse in the winter camps at the same time that I came, in summer of 47, became my wife. And I'll tell you this, and with this I'll finish. I'll tell you how I met my wife. I didn't know her. She was from Haifa, and I from Jerusalem, and who knew one each other. And I started to study at university, and she studied nursing at the American University in Beirut, in Lebanon. There were such things in the past. I wish we would be back to it. I told you that this problem of the visas getting out of the camp legally. The British gave the camps, not the British gave for everybody 1,500 per month allowances to get into Palestine. And the Jewish organization, the World Organization, the World Jewish Agency, decided 750 will go to people in Cyprus, and 750 will go to everybody else. Again, it's a little more complicated, but basically this was the situation. What did these nice British people do in 1947? You have heard, maybe you have seen the movie called Exodus, the boat called Exodus. These were people who came from the Holocaust, and many of them came from Germany. That is the past World War II Germany. And the British decided, because they knew there was no place for them in Cyprus, to return them to Germany. That's also just the very idea that you to do that sort of thing, to bring Jews 2 years after the end of the war, the end of the Holocaust, to bring people back to Germany. I mean, I think this is just unbelievable. But that's what they did. So, of course, the Jewish organization said, well, these people must get into Palestine fast. But there were no visas available for them. So they decided they will cut the visas for the people in Cyprus, which meant that everybody who knew my time will come in 3 months or in 6 months or in 8 months will be another 3 or 4 or 5 months later. Just imagine to sit another year in Cyprus. So people got very annoyed, and it was a very nasty situation. And they said, people in the camps here said, no, we don't agree. So they sent one of the leaders of the Jewish Agency at the time, later Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, to Palestine, into the camps, formally. And I wanted to you were taking pictures, I wanted to take a picture of Golda Meir getting into the camp. But there was a woman there, dressed as a nurse. I didn't know her. I told her, look, move a little bit, I'll get you in the picture together with Golda Meir. Big deal, it was a big deal, you know, with the leader. But she didn't know me, of course. She said, nothing there. There's no such picture. But we got married after that. Thank you very much.